My father died at 4:12 in the morning holding my hand, and the last thing he ever said to me was not, "I love you." It was not, "Take care of your sister." It was 7 words, whispered so quietly I had to lean my ear down to his cracked lips to catch them. Tell her the truth, not the money. 3 days earlier, sitting in a lawyer's office with a folder between us that neither of us wanted to open, he had made me promise something different. He had gripped my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a dying man and said, "David, whatever you do not tell Melissa about the 12 million. Not yet. Not until you understand why." I promised him. I meant it when I said it. And then, on the morning he died, he took that promise back with his last breath and left me standing in a hospital room at sunrise with $12 million, a sister who didn't know it existed, and no idea what he had actually meant. Welcome to Family Reckoning. If you're new here, this is where we sit with the stories nobody talks about at holiday dinners. The wills that split families, the secrets parents carry to their graves, the promises that cost more than anyone expects. I'm glad you're here. Drop the city or country you're watching from down in the comments. I like knowing where this story is landing tonight. And before we go further, a quick note. This video contains fictionalized elements combined for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental, but I promise you the lesson at the end of this is very real. Let's get into it. My name is David Hale. I'm 44 years old. I run a small architectural firm out of a converted warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, and until 14 months ago I believed I understood my father completely. Frank Hale was not a complicated man on the surface. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for as long as I could remember. He drank his coffee black because he said sugar was for people who hadn't earned the taste of things yet, which never made much sense to me, but I never asked him to explain it because that was how my father talked, in small, closed sentences that sounded like conclusions rather than invitations to discuss further. He built Hale Millwork from nothing in 1979, a custom cabinetry and architectural woodworking shop that started in a rented garage in Zanesville and grew, slowly and stubbornly, into a business with 11 employees and a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. He never talked about money. Not once in 40-some years did I hear my father mention a dollar figure attached to his own life. When people asked how business was, he said steady. And that was the whole answer, delivered the way you'd confirm the weather. I did not know, until the week he died, that Hale Millwork had quietly acquired the commercial property beneath 3 strip malls in the growing corridor outside Zanesville over the course of the 1990s. Back when the land was worth almost nothing and my father was the only person in the county who believed the highway expansion everyone was talking about would actually happen. I did not know that he had sold 2 of those properties in 2019 for a number with 7 digits in front of the decimal point, and quietly rolled the proceeds into an investment account he never mentioned at a single Thanksgiving dinner. I did not know any of it because my father had spent 30 years building something and then spent the next 20 years making absolutely sure nobody could see what he'd built. My sister Melissa is 2 years older than me. She lives 40 minutes from where we grew up, in the house she and her ex-husband bought together before the divorce took the house along with almost everything else. She works as a dental hygienist. She raises her 12-year-old son mostly on her own, and for the last 6 years, every conversation I've had with her has, at some point, circled back to money. Not asking for it directly, never directly, but the weight of it sitting underneath every sentence. The car that needed a transmission. The insurance premium that doubled. The summer camp she couldn't afford to send Tyler to, so she told him camp wasn't really his thing this year, instead of telling him the truth. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further into this story, because I think honesty is the whole point of what happened. My sister was not always careful with money. In her late 20s, before Tyler was born, Melissa went through a period our family still refers to carefully, in low voices, as the hard years. A gambling problem that started at a casino 2 hours from home and ended with a repossessed car, a maxed line of credit our father had to quietly cover so it wouldn't hit her credit permanently, and 18 months of Sunday phone calls where my mother cried after she hung up and never told me why until years later. Melissa got help. She got real help, the kind that actually works, 11 years of it now, steady, unglamorous, the kind of recovery nobody makes documentaries about because it just looks like a woman going to work and picking her son up from school and not doing the thing anymore, day after day after day. I am proud of my sister. I want that said clearly, because what happened next is not a story about whether Melissa deserved anything. It's a story about what fear does to a father's love, even a good father, even a father who loved both his children without measuring one against the other out loud. I found out about the money on a Tuesday afternoon, 9 days before he died, in a lawyer's office 2 blocks from the hospital where hospice had set up the bed my father would spend his final week in. The lawyer was a woman named Patricia Grant, sharp-eyed, careful with her words in the way of someone who had delivered difficult news in this exact office more times than she could count. My father had asked her to bring me in alone. He was thin by then. Cancer takes a big man and makes him look borrowed, like he's wearing a coat that used to fit someone larger. He sat in the chair across from Patricia's desk with a wool blanket over his knees even though it was July, and he watched me read through the documents she slid across the table with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not pride, not even relief. Something closer to dread. Total estate value, $12,340,000. The commercial property sale. The investment account. 2 life insurance policies he'd paid into since I was in elementary school. The business itself, which alone was valued at just under $2 million. Dad, I said, and I remember my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. I don't understand. Why haven't we ever? Because your sister can't know, he said. Flat, final, the same tone he used to confirm the weather. I looked at Patricia. She didn't look surprised, which told me this was a conversation they'd already had, probably more than once, probably over the course of months while I was 3 states away not knowing my father was dying by inches. Dad, you can't do that. She's your daughter. She has a right to a life where she isn't handed $12 million 4 years after she nearly lost everything to a slot machine. His hand shook when he reached for the water glass on the desk, and I watched him steady it with his other hand before he lifted it to drink. You think I don't know what that would do to her? You think I haven't lost sleep over this for 6 years? So don't leave her out of the will. Leave it to her in a trust. Structure it so she can't. I tried that, he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly. The first crack I'd heard in my father's voice in my entire adult life. Patricia drew up 3 different trust structures. David, I couldn't stop imagining the day she found out how much was there. I couldn't stop imagining what that number does to a person who's been counting quarters for 6 years just to keep the lights on. I've watched what money does to people. I built a business watching contractors and clients and men I respected turn into strangers the second a number got big enough. He set the water glass down very carefully, the way a man sets down something he doesn't trust his hands with anymore. I am asking you to hold this. Manage the trust. Dispense to her what she needs when she needs it, in amounts that don't destroy her. I am asking you to protect her from the very thing I'm giving her. I sat with that for a long moment. Patricia slid another folder toward me, the trust documents already drafted, already naming me as sole trustee with what she called broad discretionary authority, which is a polite legal way of saying I would have complete control over whether my sister ever saw a single dollar of it. And if I say no? I asked. My father looked at me, and for just a second, the dread in his face resolved into something almost like fear. Then I don't know what to do, he said, because I am out of time to figure out anything better. I promised him. God help me. I promised him, sitting in that office with the July sun cutting hard lines across the carpet, because my father was dying and he was asking me for the one thing he had never asked me for in 44 years, which was to carry something heavy on his behalf. I need to pause the story here for a second, because I know some of you are already forming an opinion about my father, and I want to be fair to him before we go further. Comment, still here below if you're staying for the rest of this, because what comes next changes everything I thought I understood about that promise. And one quick note before we continue. A few details in this story have been adjusted for privacy and pacing, though the emotional core is drawn from real family experiences. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for tonight, no hard feelings. Feel free to click away. But if you want to see where this actually goes, stay with me. The 9 days between that lawyer's office and my father's death are not days I remember in order. They come back to me in fragments, the way grief tends to store things, not as a timeline but as a series of rooms I keep walking back into. I remember my Aunt Rosalind, my father's younger sister, sitting with him on the 3rd day, holding a cup of ice chips and telling him about her grandkid's soccer schedule in a voice pitched deliberately light, the way you talk to someone you're trying to keep tethered to ordinary life for just a few more minutes. Rosalind had been the one who called me 2 months earlier to tell me, gently, that I needed to come home sooner rather than later, that Dad wasn't telling me how bad it had gotten because he didn't want to be a burden, which was such a profoundly Frank Hale thing to worry about that I'd laughed and cried in the same phone call. I remember our family's longtime accountant, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Pruitt who had done the books for Hale Millwork since 1988, coming by the hospice room on the 5th day with a stack of papers my father needed to sign. Gerald had known about the money longer than I had, years longer, it turned out. He was the one who'd first flagged the strip mall property as undervalued back in the early 90s and quietly encouraged my father to hold onto it instead of taking the modest offer that came in. When Gerald left that day, he caught me in the hallway and said something I didn't fully understand until much later. "Your dad's not wrong to be scared, David, but being scared of a thing and being right about a thing aren't always the same, and I think somewhere in him, he knows that too." I remember Melissa herself, visiting every single day, sitting on the other side of the bed from me, holding our father's hand, having no idea what sat folded in a manila envelope in my car in the parking garage. She brought Tyler twice. My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before when Tyler walked in. Some kind of unguarded softening, like a door left open a crack. He asked Tyler about school. He asked if the transmission on Melissa's car had finally gotten fixed. Melissa laughed and said, "We're managing, Dad. Don't worry about us." In the particular bright voice she'd been using for 6 years to convince everyone, including herself, that managing was the same thing as fine. I sat there every day with $12 million folded into a promise in my chest, watching my sister say "we're managing" to a dying man who could have made managing a word she never had to say again, and I felt something in me start to come apart at the seams. On the 7th night, I couldn't sleep, so I drove out to the old Hale millwork shop, the original building my father still kept even after the business expanded into a larger facility across town. He'd never sold it. Said it was sentimental, which was one more word I'd never heard him use before that year. I let myself in with the spare key that had hung on the same hook in our kitchen my whole life, and I stood in the dark among the table saws and the smell of sawdust that never really leaves a place like that, and I found, in the small office at the back, a filing cabinet I'd never had reason to open. Inside, tucked behind old tax records, was a shoebox, newspaper clippings, a photograph of Melissa at maybe 26, laughing at something off camera, before the hard years started. A folded letter in my mother's handwriting, dated 11 years ago, the year Melissa's gambling collapsed everything. A letter my mother had apparently written to my father and never sent, working through her own fear on paper the way some people do. And beneath that, a second folder, more recent, with Patricia Grant's letterhead on it. Notes. My father's handwriting, cramped and urgent, working through drafts of what he wanted to say to me. Crossed out lines. Attempts. One page had nothing on it but a single sentence, written and underlined 3 times. "I am not trying to punish her. I am trying to save her from me not being here to catch her if it goes wrong again." That was the moment I understood the promise differently. My father hadn't hidden the money from Melissa because he didn't trust her. He'd hidden it because he didn't trust himself to die without a plan in place that could survive without him standing over it, watching, ready to intervene if the money became a wound instead of a gift. He was a man who had spent his whole life solving problems with his hands, and here was a problem, his own mortality, that his hands couldn't touch. So he'd built the only structure he knew how to build under pressure. Control, secrecy, a trustee he trusted absolutely. Me. I sat on the office floor of that old shop until almost 3 a.m., the shoebox open in my lap, and for the first time since the lawyer's office, I didn't feel angry at my father. I felt the exact shape of his fear, because it was starting to become my own. He died 2 days later. It happened faster than the hospice nurse expected. A sudden shift in his breathing around 3 a.m. that had my aunt calling me at my hotel to come quickly. I made it in time. Melissa did not. She was 40 minutes away, and by the time she arrived it was already over, and I have carried the guilt of that timing every day since. The accident of geography that meant I was the one holding his hand at the end and she was the one who walked into a room where it had already happened. In those last minutes, my father's breathing went long and shallow, and I leaned close because I could see his lips moving and no sound was coming out. I put my ear an inch from his mouth. "Tell her the truth," he whispered. "Not the money." I pulled back to look at him, not sure I'd heard it right, and he found enough strength to say it once more, slower, each word its own small effort. "Tell her the truth, not the money." Those were the last words my father ever said. He died 11 minutes later before I could ask him what he meant, before I could ask whether he was releasing me from the promise or giving me a different instruction entirely, before I could ask anything at all. I spent the next 3 weeks turning that sentence over like a stone in my pocket, worn smooth from handling. Tell her the truth, not the money. Was he telling me to tell Melissa about the trust, but not hand her the full sum? Was he telling me to tell her the reason, the fear, the shoebox, my mother's unsent letter, without telling her the number? Or was he, in the disorientation of his final moments, simply confused, grasping at something that made perfect sense inside his own dying mind and came out to me as a riddle? The funeral was on a Thursday. My sister spoke beautifully. She talked about our father teaching her to sand a tabletop when she was 9 years old, pressing her small hand flat against the wood and saying, "Feel that. That's what done feels like, when your hand stops wanting to keep going." I hadn't known that story. It struck something in me, sitting in the second pew, that my father had built the same kind of quiet, hands-on love into both of us. And somewhere along the way, 6 years of hard times had made him afraid that love wasn't going to be enough protection for her anymore. Patricia Grant called me the following Monday to begin the formal administration of the estate. I asked her to give me 2 more weeks before we filed anything, before the trust became a document with legal weight instead of a folder in my car. She agreed cautiously and told me something I hadn't fully absorbed before. As sole trustee with discretionary authority, I had the legal right to restructure the terms of the trust myself, within reason, as long as I filed an amendment before the estate was formally settled. My father had given me control, which meant he had, whether he intended it fully or not, given me the power to undo the very secrecy he'd asked me to keep. I spent those 2 weeks the way I imagine most people spend the hardest decisions of their lives. Badly, unevenly, talking myself in and out of things at 2 a.m., calling my wife Carol into the kitchen more nights than I can count to lay it all out on the table again like she hadn't heard it 11 times already. Carol had known Melissa since college. She'd been there for some of the worst years, had sat with Melissa in a diner once at midnight while Melissa cried about a collection call. Years before any of us knew the full scope of what was happening. Carol listened to me work through it for the 7th or 8th time on a Tuesday night, the shoebox sitting open on our kitchen table between 2 cold cups of coffee, and finally she put her hand flat on the table and said something that cut straight through the noise in my head. "David, you keep asking what your father wanted. I think you already know what he wanted. He wanted her protected, and he wanted her to know she was loved enough to be protected. He just ran out of time to figure out how to do both of those things without lying to her. That's your job now, not his, yours." I called Melissa on a Sunday morning and asked if I could come by. She said, of course, thinking it was about splitting up Dad's tools, or deciding what to do with the old shop, the kinds of ordinary post-funeral logistics siblings work through together. I drove to her house with the shoebox and the trust folder both sitting on the passenger seat, and I sat across from her at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten 1,000 meals as a kid on the nights our parents dropped us off for sleepovers with our cousins. I told her everything. The lawyer's office, the promise, the number. I watched her face move through disbelief, then something that looked almost like betrayal, then a long silence where she just stared at the folder without touching it. $12 million, she finally said, very quietly. "And you knew for how long? A month? You've known for a month, and you sat at Dad's funeral and let me cry about splitting the funeral costs 3 ways." "I know," I said. "I know how that sounds. I need you to understand why he did it before you decide how angry to be at me." I told her about the shoebox. I read her our mother's unsent letter, 11 years old, full of a fear so raw it made Melissa put her hand over her mouth halfway through. I told her about the page with the sentence underlined 3 times. "I am not trying to punish her. I am trying to save her from me not being here to catch her." I told her about his last words, the ones I still didn't fully understand. Tell her the truth, not the money. Melissa sat with all of it for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of the anger from a few minutes before. "I used to lie in bed during the worst of it," she said, "and think about how disappointed he must have been. He never said it. He never once said it to my face. But I could feel it, David. I could feel him watching me like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop for years afterward. And it turns out he wasn't disappointed. He was scared. He was scared the whole time, and I never knew because he never let me see it because that's what he did with everything hard. He just carried it alone and called it steady." "I think," I said slowly, working it out loud as I said it, "that's what he meant, at the end. He wasn't telling me to hide the money from you. He was telling me the money was never actually the point. He needed you to know the truth of why, that it came from love and fear tangled together, not from doubt in who you'd become. The money was just the vehicle. The truth was the thing he actually wanted to give you, and he ran out of time to say it himself, so he made me the one who had to say it for him." We didn't solve everything at that kitchen table. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this get told too cleanly sometimes, like grief and money and 11 years of hard history resolve themselves in a single afternoon. They don't. Melissa and I sat with Patricia Grant 3 separate times over the following 2 months, restructuring the trust together. Not me holding sole discretionary control the way my father's original document had it, but the two of us as co-trustees, with the financial counselor Melissa chose herself brought in for the first year to help her build the structures and the accountability she wanted, not the structures I would have imposed on her out of fear. She kept a modest, steady monthly distribution instead of taking a lump sum. She paid off the house. She set up a fund for Tyler's education that neither of us can touch without the other's signature. She went back into counseling for a few months, not because she'd slipped, she was very clear about that, but because she said she wanted to make sure the number didn't quietly start rewriting who she was when nobody was watching, the way it almost had for a stretch of years before the hard times taught her what watching herself actually looked like. I gave up sole control of $8 million I legally could have kept managing entirely on my own terms, because I finally understood that my father's real instruction, whispered with his last breath, was never about protecting Melissa from money. It was about not letting the secret become one more thing standing between the two of us the way silence had already stood between him and both of us for most of our lives. It's been 14 months now. Melissa runs a small side bookkeeping practice out of her home 2 evenings a week. Something she'd wanted to do for years and finally had the breathing room to start. Tyler made the travel soccer team this spring, and Melissa didn't have to tell him it wasn't really his thing. My Aunt Rosalind still calls every few weeks to check on both of us, and I think she does it because she promised our father, quietly, that she'd keep an eye on whether the two of us were actually all right, not just managing. I kept the old shop. I go there sometimes on Saturday mornings the way my father used to, and I run my hand along the workbench where I found that shoebox, and I think about how close I came to keeping his secret the way he originally asked me to. I think about how a promise made out of love can still be the wrong promise, and how the harder, better love was the one he found in the last 11 minutes of his life, when everything else had already burned away and all that was left was the truth he actually wanted my sister to have. If there is one thing this whole year has taught me, it's this: money does not fix what silence breaks. My father spent a fortune trying to protect my sister from a mistake she'd already spent 11 years recovering from on her own, and the thing that actually healed something between us wasn't the $12 million. It was one whispered sentence that undid a promise built on fear and replaced it with one built on trust. Do not wait until your last 11 minutes to say the thing that actually matters. Say it now while you still have the time to explain it, to sit with the anger it might cause, to walk through it together instead of leaving someone else to carry it alone. These family stories are hard to tell, and this one especially so, but I believe they're worth telling because somewhere out there tonight, someone is holding on to a secret they think is protecting someone they love, when really, it's just delaying a conversation that love is strong enough to survive. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment and tell me what you'd have done in David's position. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Family Reckoning so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than you know. One last note. Certain names, timelines, and details in this story have been adjusted for privacy and dramatic pacing. If fictionalized family drama isn't your thing, no hard feelings, but if it is, I've got more of these waiting for you.